morning and welcome, and thank you all for being here. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. We offer programs in a wide range of topics, and sometimes we're lucky enough to work with one of our other cultural organizations in the communities we serve. This evening's program is one such case in collaborating with the Weston Playhouse, and I'm very happy to have Steve Stettler do this presentation. But before I introduce him, I'd like to acknowledge the work of gnat-tv, GNAT, and thank them for being here to videotape the program. They produce and air many programs on their local access station, including several of Green Mountain Academy's presentations. And I'd also like to encourage anyone new to Green Mountain Academy to please visit our website. I see a lot of new faces here today. Our winter season is just about over, but we are adding our new summer programs to the website, so please take a look. And now this evening's speaker. Steve Stettler is the producing artistic director of the Weston Playhouse Theater Company. His directing credits range from the world premiere of the chamber version of Adam Guettel's The Light in the Piazza at Weston to the revival of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Carousel at the Norwegian State Theater in Oslo. The creator and director of Weston's nationally recognized New Works programs, Steve just completed 2 terms as a member of the board of directors of the National Alliance for Musical Theater and is past co-chair of the committee for its annual Festival of New Musicals in New York City. Please help me welcome Steve Stettler.
Thank you all. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Rocco. Thank you, GMALL. People who've been involved with GMALL for a while will not be surprised to hear that I got an email 2 days ago from Rita Silverman. So glad to hear that you're back in the lineup. So she, of course, sends fond greetings to everyone. The last time I was in this room, she introduced me. So what a wonderful program you have, and it's great to be a part of it. We have a lot of people in the room tonight who are either staff or board of the various fine arts and culture organizations that we all enjoy in this area, and we have obviously a room full of passionate supporters of all of them. We see ourselves as colleagues and comrades, not as competition. It's the sense of community that makes Vermont so special, and that is there in the arts as well. So thanks for being here. Please support one another. That's how we all continue to do what we do and do more of it as the years go on. So here to talk tonight about the new American musical, but I need some help. I need an artist, Dave. If you would, I hope that pen will work. Just quickly draw a beach ball there. Okay, thank you. You're done. Okay, good. Would you draw a basketball here, but please keep in mind the beach ball that was drawn by Dave. Okay. All right? Maybe. A little larger basketball than I might. And Judy, would you draw a golf ball over here? Is that how close you stand when you're putting? All right. What I'm going to do, because it's going to be hard to shrink the basketball, is I'm going to blow up Dave's beach ball just a little more. And we're going to call, I used to be a teacher, but my handwriting, like my eyesight, has deteriorated. But we're going to call Dave's beach ball operetta. We're going to call the basketball Golden Age, and we're going to call the golf ball the new musical. And I am not a jock, so this is probably a really bad series of metaphors already, but we'll try. I'm going to talk about the first 2, but we're going to dwell on the golf ball today, because I suspect you know more about the first 2. Do you know that the musical theater is really the only form of live theater that's actually credited to our country? Most world culture and most theater, of course, goes way back to the Greeks and so forth. But musical theater is said to have begun in the 1860s in New York by accident. Now, I run the Weston Playhouse, which burned down, thankfully, before I was there. Came back from the ashes. And sometimes accidents can be wonderful things, because the beautiful building we have now is a result of that fire. Well, in the 1860s in New York, an impresario was running a huge vaudeville house called Niblo's Gardens. And he had a 4-something-hour dog of a melodrama called The Black Crook. It was awful, it was endless, it was ponderous. It was very loosely based on the Faust myth. And the story was that a dissolute count took a liking to a young lass in the village and arranged for her fiancé to be stolen by the Black Crook, who was a hunchback sorcerer, who every year made a bargain with the devil that if he gave the devil another hale and hearty male or female, he could have another humped-back year of black sorcery. So this young man was about, unknowingly, to ensure another year for the Black Crook when he saved a dove. And it turned out, of course, that it wasn't a dove, but it was a fairy goddess who turned back into her fairy goddessness in a very elaborate and ponderous scene, blessed him, and they punished the bad people, and the young people got back together, and everything was wonderful. But it took 4 hours, and that wasn't enough for him, so he hired people to come in and sing popular music of the day to see if that would bring more of an audience. It only made the piece longer and more ponderous. Then a fire happened, and a Parisian ballet troupe that had been booked into the Academy of Music in New York were suddenly homeless. They had come to dance, and the building caught on fire, and they had nowhere to dance. So this impresario had nothing left to do. They didn't have dinner theater in those days, so he didn't think about opening a restaurant. So he asked them if they would come, and he would pay them something, because they were getting paid nothing to dance in a burned-down building, to dance in the Black Crook. And lo and behold, that did it. And the Black Crook became 5.5 hours long and sold out for a year. 474 performances, I believe, hitting a record on what would eventually be Broadway, the Great White Way. And that was the inauspicious and not very likely birth of the musical theater. So it's probably not the best way for us as a country to take credit of anything cultural, because Lord knows we're not going to do a revival of the Black Crook at the Weston Playhouse or anywhere else. But that was the beginning. And that began the era that I'm calling the Beach Ball era, which loosely, as it began to form itself, is the era that we know best as the era of operetta. Through the 19th century into the early 20th century, and of course it developed through Romberg and Frimmel and all of those kind of medium-priced champagne kind of guys. It crystallized in Gilbert and Sullivan, who were good enough to still be produced on any stage today and enjoyed. And it began to morph into something else in the 20s and 30s, and finally, with a guy named Jerome Kern and another guy named Oscar Hammerstein, a huge show called, thank you, Showboat, turned the tide, literally and figuratively, and we moved into what we will now call the basketball era or the golden age, and I'll explain the ball images in a minute. I'm not going to play any music from that first era, and I'm only going to play you one song from the second, because you could hum all of these and a few of those. But let me play you the song that really kind of drove us into that era, if I get my technology right.
There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. There's a bright golden haze on the meadow.
And the name of the singer is
The corn is as
Alfred Drake.
and it looks like
And who played this most recently on Broadway and now plays superheroes on film? Hugh Jackman.
beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I got a beautiful feeling, and everything's going my way. All the
Now, if we had more time, which we don't, I'd let you just sit here and enjoy and listen to that whole thing. think, yes.
When did you jump and play in Oklahoma?
Oh boy, it's been probably 10 or more years now.
It was on PBS recently.
Yeah, yeah. He did it first on the West End and then on Broadway, playing Curly. Yeah,
It was very good, too.
it was the revival that came out of the National Theatre in London. I saw him. What do you see? The curtain opens, and you've come out of the beach ball era, where you've got fairies and scenery and Parisian dancers, and suddenly you come to a big Broadway theater, and the curtain opens, and there's one cowboy on stage singing about the weather in the Midwest. Where are we?
Oklahoma.
Yeah. There's the beginning of a very different era in the theater. And the ingredients in that classic musical are the ones that almost everybody who wrote during the Golden Age, most of whom wrote as somebody and somebody, Lerner and Lowe, you could name them all, right? Really followed. There was almost a formula. And what they did to the musical was to compress it, thank goodness, from the 5.5 hours of the beach ball there to something more like 3 with sometimes several intermissions. Orchestras of sometimes 30 instruments, large choruses, but a central storyline. And the difference from the operetta era, or the early operetta era in particular, is that the characters drove the story and the songs forwarded the story. The songs were an interlude. The songs were a diversion. The songs were a who can I bring in to sell the black crook kind of thing in the early era of musical theater. Obviously, as operetta developed, it became more integrated, but still not as dramatic and not as well crafted, ultimately, as the great musicals of the Golden Age. And dance. Think of Agnes de Mille and all those great dances that were done for Rodgers and Hammerstein, where the big joke now is putting a dream ballet in every play. But in fact, that was no joke. The dream ballet forwarded the story. It was not a break from the story where everybody suddenly did a dance number like they do with a boyfriend or something and you just had a good time. It actually told the story, and you had Dream Laurie, and you had the struggle with Judd and all of that. And of course, you see that as you look at all the rest of Rodgers and Hammerstein's musicals, and again, the ones that surround it. I was lucky enough a year ago to sit this close to Julie Andrews at dinner. Some friends of mine down at the Goodspeed Opera House in Connecticut. And of course, I wanted to ask her a million questions and couldn't ask them all, but one of the things she told me is that there used to be a kind of a dream ballet thing in the early stages of My Fair Lady, which thank goodness they got rid of at the end of the first act. And they wanted her to dance, and she's not a dancer, so she was much happier with what they did afterward. In any case, you come to this period that we all know best, from really the 40s, I would say, up through the 80s. And you've got these well-crafted pieces where character and song and dance forward the story. And that was the essence of musicals until a guy comes along and changes that, and we move toward the golf ball era, and I'm going to credit primarily one person and play a little bit of his music now as an intro to that period. That ain't Oklahoma. And I love Oklahoma. These are not value judgments. These are distinctions. What kind of a world have you walked into now? I remember when this show came out, which is Sweeney Todd, and I told my dear parents that I was going to go see a musical in New York that was about a mad barber who slit the throats of his victims while his girlfriend baked them into meat pies, and my parents were thoroughly convinced I should not go to the theater ever again. I still think it's one of the great works of the modern theater. This is a concert version at Carnegie Hall. This musical's been played in major opera companies. Getting into very adventurous subject matter, and often into truly operatic music. Music that people accuse Sondheim of not being hummable. But much of the reason that Sondheim isn't hummable, aside from the fact that it's very sophisticated music, is that he doesn't do what Rodgers and Hammerstein and their friends did. When you went to see Oklahoma, you heard an overture. Even if you'd never been to Oklahoma, you heard all the hits before the show started. Then they did all the songs in the first act. Then you heard an entr'acte, where you heard all the songs again. Then you heard reprises of all the songs in the second act. And whenever there were dances, they put in themes that actually echoed the songs you'd already heard in the overture and the entr'acte and the first time and the reprise. And then they had bows where you heard all the songs again. And then, in those days, the great popular singers picked up the best of those songs and recorded them in their own style, and you heard it on the radio. And you bought the LP. You couldn't not hum those shows. But you can sing Send in the Clowns right now if I ask you to, can't you? Some of you probably would if I asked you. Okay, now granted, that's a bit more tuneful than some Sondheim. But it really wasn't that they stopped writing tunes. It was that there was a new formula. And now we forward the musical through the complex plot line, not through the formulaic repetition of song and sound. And it is a more complex journey, and frankly, more fraught with error. It is, I would say, arguably easier to follow a formula. I am no writer. But when I have a formula or an outline for putting something together, witness my ball image up here, I can start to hang things on that and accomplish a little bit more. But when I have to create something out of whole cloth and there are no rules, and sometimes the story isn't linear, and the songs are going to take the characters in strange and new dangerous places, and I'm going to try not so much to repeat, but as to create a complex new fabric, I don't even know where I'm going sometimes. And there are often times when the audience didn't or the book writer didn't, and there are more failed musicals from this later period than there were from the earlier period, because the rules are kind of, in some ways, blown out the door. But we're going to talk about what you can start to recognize as some of the rules and some of the characteristics of those new musicals in a minute. Let me get back to the ball images. So my generalized theory is that in the era of operetta, we have beach balls. If I were going to be the acting teacher I used to be in high school, I would play one of those games where I would toss it to you and say, Chris, catch that as a beach ball. Now send it back to me as a basketball. What do? Not only compress it, but you toss it differently. The beach ball game is what? It's something fun to do for a bunch of people that are out for the day. They're not necessarily athletic, they're just having a good time. There are no particular rules to it. Probably won't last terribly long. It doesn't require teamwork. It's very kind of light and fluffy and silly, and if you never do it again, it's not the end of your life. Now I'm being judgmental, but that's the operetta era, certainly at its worst. The great pieces of all three eras will last for all time. But the essence of this period was 5.5 hours of air held together by a producer, but not a concept. Not forwarding plot so much as throwing elements together to entertain. We get to this era and we compress. With a basketball, which again I didn't play, but I had a brother who did. Now we need teamwork. We need some rules of the game. We have to work together. Most people don't just take a basketball out and throw it around if they haven't learned what to do with it a little bit. But once you get that teamwork going, who hasn't seen a basketball game or probably even handled one in their lives now? This became very populist in a different way, because you started to learn the rules, and the same people that liked Oklahoma, liked My Fair Lady, liked Hello Dolly, liked Fiddler on the Roof, those are all different, but they're actually all based on the same formula, the same model, and the same reliable rules when you went into the theater. And so we had what we now fondly call the golden age of really great, great musicals. I mean, Weston does more from this era, certainly very few from that, and we're making our way into this era. But there's a lot of reasons we call it the Golden Age. When we get down to the era we're going to concentrate on today, the reason I've made it a golf ball is that the form itself continues to be compressed. The 5.5 hours that went down to 3, and the ballet companies and the extra singers and all that that were added, that become the formulated group of the hero and the heroine and the comic couple and the evil guy and the older woman who's wise and gets the 11 o'clock number and the dream ballet and all the rest of that becomes the formula there. When we get here, it's so compressed. Number one, it's shorter. The orchestra, you hardly see a musical with an orchestra in New York anymore. In Weston, of course, we have now an orchestra pit, so we have the largest orchestras we've ever had in Weston, which are still only 6 people. But in New York, it's not uncommon to actually see a Broadway show that's played by 4 or 5 musicians. And there isn't the traditional chorus anymore. There's an ensemble, and that's one of the things that Sondheim was doing in a very early stage. And in fact, you could see his precursor there in his friend Leonard Bernstein and what was happening in West Side Story, for which Sondheim wrote most of the lyrics, but not the music. So it's compressed. Also, again, arguably like golf, it becomes more of an individual game. So I would argue that you are more likely to choose the kind of musical you like to go see now. Whereas in the 50s and 60s, if somebody said, you want to go see a Broadway musical, you would say yes, because you kind of knew what it was. Now, well, is it a rock musical? Is it a jukebox musical? Is it about some horrible subject? Is it an hour long and abstract and largely dance? You kind of want to know what it is, so you're going to be much more selective. There's more of it, actually, now than there ever was. There's more new musical work being created here and around the world than in the Golden Age or in the operetta. But it's more selective, and frankly, a lot more of it doesn't work because the rules have been thrown out and they're reinventing them. So we got a lot of golf balls being thrown around there, but not everybody always willing to play, which is why theaters like us will try to take a risk on some new pieces, but by and large are going to do the ones that we all know are going to work by the time we've finished the evening in the theater. All right, that brings my little ball metaphor together. Now let me get back to some of the music. Questions so far? Obviously, to make large points like this, I have to generalize, but there's a truth in this.
Could you give us a couple of examples of the popular operettas? Would they be things I would recognize?
It depends on whether you know popular operettas. Probably more of you know them than I do, but the Student Prince, again, any Gilbert and Sullivan, Naughty Marietta, Merry Widow, Lehar, Desert Song. We did a dismal production of Desert Song years ago in the non-equity days of Weston. Oh, it was bad. I had to play it every night. I can remember how bad it was. And some of those are worth bringing back, but a lot of them are not. Other questions before we keep moving on?
Do you think that younger audiences today are still as drawn to the Golden Age kind of musicals now?
And I don't think that's a comment on the lack of those shows being good. I'll tell you when they're drawn to them, is when somebody takes a fresh approach to it that is not kind of lovingly historical. The National Theatre in London, I mean, the Brits have kind of stolen our form a lot. Let's face it, there have been a lot of years where there were more musicals coming to Broadway from England than from here. But the National Theatre in London has done a particularly fine job, and more recently a smaller theatre called the Donmar Warehouse in London, of bringing a fresh approach. And if you saw the revival of Carousel that was done at Lincoln Center years ago that came out of the National Theatre, if you saw more recently the new production of La Cage aux Folles that came out of London that was done as a kind of a seedy nightclub with a much smaller group, or the production of Cabaret that was done in Studio 54 that started at the Donmar Warehouse in London. It came over here where you were actually in the nightclub with those people. It's when somebody finds a strong new concept for a piece. Look what happened with the film of Chicago and the current revival of Chicago, which was done purely as a staged concert. and through its simplicity actually made the piece work in a fresh new way. So I find, in my experience here and in New York and elsewhere, that younger audiences are drawn when there's some strong new creative approach to the older pieces. But understandably, by and large, they're very into the rock musicals. And we're going to talk about that form in a minute. Monica.
Steve, is there another larger ball? I'm thinking whether operetta is derivative from opera, whether it was in effect opera for the masses.
I think I am not, one of the great gaps in my education is opera. The little experience I had with opera was sadly laughable when I was in college and went to see the Met on tour and saw 800-pound women dying of consumption, and the elephants were smaller, and it just didn't work for me. So I need somebody to take me to opera now. I started to fall in love with it when I was directing Masterclass and got interested in Callas,
Well, you have a
the stories
great
that she did.
opportunity
But
with this HD Live.
I know, exactly. Yeah, and in fact, here's a little known fact. The interim managing director at the Weston Playhouse right now, how's that for a kind of confusing highfalutin title, directed the Cose fan tutte, which will be the April 26th Met broadcast and was the return of James Levine to the Met. Thank you very much. So that's as close as I get to opera right now. I work with her. Let's move on. Or was there a question? Okay, good. We will have time for more questions afterward, but let me see if I can catch up with my own notes here now. Yes, and there's one other, actually, besides the balls, I want you to remember 3 titles here. The Black Crook, which, again, I think you'll probably never see or hear again. Here, and I'm not saying this was the greatest musical of the era, but you'll see why I put it down in a minute. Damn Yankees, which we did a few years ago at Weston. And here, a title that, unless you're deeply involved with Weston or incredibly smart, you've never heard of, Analog and Vinyl. So we're going to compare the 3 balls and the 3 titles in a minute, too. Because these are musicals from each of these 3 eras that are all based on the Faust myth. Speaking of opera. I already gave you an idea of how loosely and kind of incompetently The Black Crook was based on that. Most of you know Damn Yankees. Ray Walston, better known to my generation from My Favorite Martian, but played the devil in that, who makes the bargain with Shoeless Joe from Hannibal Moe to make him the best baseball player if he'll sell his soul and stay youthful and be a great ball player. So that was the kind of everyman sports middle class dream of the Faust myth, which in many ways embodies what the Golden Age musical was about and who they were reaching. The show that we're going to open this summer with is a world premiere musical called Analog and Vinyl. Analog and Vinyl would be what? I didn't even know when I heard the title.
Records.
God bless you. 2 tickets to the show. Get his name and address. Analog and Vinyl is about people who love LPs. And the real lovers of music, of course, still love them when they're in really good shape and you have a really good turntable. And they're starting to come back now. But this new musical with a rock score is about a young couple in their late 20s, early 30s who run a failed LP store in what was his father's old convenience store. And into the shop comes a mysterious stranger who is a devil. Maybe a man, maybe a woman. We don't even know yet in this production which it's going to be. And makes them an offer that will make their business successful, but will ask them to sacrifice everything else that they believe in order to get it. And it's a story that passes through time and morphs, but is always a good story that grabs you. But look at The Black Crook, 5.5 hours long, and a cast of, I don't know how many, 100. Damn Yankees, I'm guessing probably 2.5 hours. That's about what they are in that era. Probably a cast in the 30s. Analog and Vinyl is 90 minutes, no intermission, 3 actors, 4 musicians. Welcome to golf ball time. Still a good show, but we're compressing for a lot of reasons. Obviously also attention span and economy and budget. Let's not compare what it cost to go to The Black Crook or Damn Yankees when it opened in the 60s to what it costs even in Weston if you don't get a Vermont ticket. to go see analog and vinyl now. Theater's becoming so darn expensive, and that's, you know, another one of our big problems, obviously. All right. Now I'm going to jump to this era of the new musical and suggesting Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein as the bridge to this era, and Stephen Sondheim as we move toward complex score, lack of repeated music, often more dangerous themes, and almost sometimes semi-operatic music. And there are really three primary categories to the new musical. One of those, which is the one that I would put Sondheim in, I would call the legit. And that would be the musicals that, if they don't start out, will someday probably be done in an opera house. Now, granted, we remember in the heyday of New York City Opera, they would do not just Sondheim, but some of the great classics of the Golden Age, too. But truly operatic scores, Light in the Piazza, if you saw that on Broadway or at Weston, or both. Adam Gettle's work, absolutely out of the legit world. He was a voice soprano at the Met, no surprise. That particular Sondheim-influenced group is generally considered to be more highbrow, difficult for an audience that's not willing to listen to the music in advance or listen to it several times. And it often picks a storyline. In the case of Light in the Piazza, it didn't, thank goodness, but that you're not really sure you want to go with, like Sweeney Todd and many of the other subjects that Sondheim tackles. The kind of middle of the road is the pop or contemporary musical, into which still the bulk of commercially successful musicals fit now. And we're doing one of the great classics of that era this summer for the first time in, I don't know, 28 years at Weston. And we'll just put on the wonderful ballad from that. So,
Kiss today goodbye.
music by Marvin Hamlisch, who just died recently, clearly a pop composer, a master at what he did. Very singable, but not operatic. And the third category, which we're going to talk about in a minute, not rock.
But I can't regret what I did for love, what I did for love. Look, my eyes are dry. The gift was ours to borrow.
Think about this show. Never mind. Think about this show and its structure, too. You've got, really, American Idol before American Idol ever happened, don't you? You got a bunch of kids on stage auditioning, and by the end, 8 of them get the job. And when I was young and saw this, I was too young to get it. But, of course, it's called a chorus line. And throughout the show, you come to care, as you do in the best episodes of American Idol or The Voice or any of those shows that are on now, about the individual and their story and their journey and whether they're going to win. But what happens when they win in a chorus line? Suddenly, they're all in the same costume doing the same step, completely invisible as part of the machinery that actually backs up the stars. Ironic. And it's an ensemble show where the chorus numbers aren't the dancers coming in to forward the story. They're actually the story of those people as it expands beyond their individual story in the circumstance they're actually living out. Groundbreaking show for its time and still today. It revolutionized how musicals were rehearsed and developed because a group of dancers, including a good friend of mine, just got together and started telling their stories on tape. And Michael Bennett heard about this, came in and said, we got to make a show out of this. And selected and formed it and got a studio, and they just kept working until they thought they had a show. That isn't how you did shows before then. You took Lerner and Lowe or Rodgers and Hart or Rodgers and Hammerstein and you locked them in a room and they wrote a show, and you went to New Haven or Boston or Philadelphia and you tried it out, and if you didn't get killed, you learned what was wrong, and then you fixed it, and then you went to New Haven or Boston or Philadelphia and you got it more right, and eventually, if you were still alive, you brought it into New York, and by then it usually succeeded, and maybe if you were lucky, it lasted a year or two. But suddenly, a group of people came together and said, we want to tell a story, we don't quite know where it's going, we want to use this form to tell it, we want to find this together, it's going to be what it's going to be. Give me some time in a room. Pretty exciting and pretty scary at the same time, which is why a lot of pieces don't always succeed. But there's a chorus line leading us into the pop. And then, here's certainly a show that we actually had on our short list for this year, so you'll certainly see it at Weston sometime soon, but I'm sure you all know it. Try not to look at the CD covers. No cheating. This has a slightly obscured beginning, a little bit like the Sweeney Todd, but you'll recognize it in a minute. But you can tell me what it is right now without seeing the CD. You're a genius.
Here.
All right. Alfred Drake ain't going to be singing to that one. But here comes a soloist in a minute with something that we all remember. It immediately brings you back to that era, doesn't it? Rock hits the Broadway stage. I am no rocker, just as I am no jock, and I think this song is... Start shedding your clothing, we'll stop that. Great song, great show. Can anybody tell me the plot of Hair? Good luck. Not even the writers. There wasn't one. There was a kind of loosely implied plot about a gang of kids and one of them goes off to Vietnam. And that is in there and kind of needs to be in there every time you tell it, and that's about it. So actually, to some degree, we're back in beach ball land, aren't we? Except the way that ensemble tells that story and the way you get sucked into their individual stories the same way you do with Chorus Line, or arguably with the Dickensian characters of Sweeney Todd. It ain't Oklahoma, but it's a musical. And that was the beginning of the rock era. Now, we could go through each of these three categories of the new musical and take them up to present day, and if you want to throw out titles later, we can try to guess which category we think they fit in. That'll be a good parlor game if we want to go drinking after. But what I'm going to do, selfishly, because every effort as a nonprofit theater person is to also sell a ticket in your own theater, is to lead you through Hair to analog and vinyl. Because all things come down to the golf ball and to my show. So we've heard Hair. The next most important rock musical, arguably, in the history of the stage is one that we did just a few years ago at Weston. And talk about roots in opera. Sorry. Can you stand that? I know it's so loud. Rock is supposed to be loud, but...
How do you document real life when real life's getting more like fiction?
You hear the words eviction or pay. This is the kid with the camera who's documenting life, and he says real life is getting like fiction. Great show. Based on La Boheme. Same story. And you tell people the sordid story, and again, they say, I'm not going to the theater for that. But how often have they gone in and seen it when it was in La Boheme? There again, ensemble. A few songs that get repeated, but by and large, very few. No real chorus. The ensemble is the chorus. Gritty storytelling. And you almost can't tell that story without a rock score, can you? As much as I love Stephen Sondheim and Adam Guettel, I don't want to see Rent told by them, I don't think. There's something about that beat and that visceral feel that worked for Rent. Yes?
But what about Stephen Sondheim's, he was a great contributor to Larson for writing Rent.
Well, he's an inspiration to anybody.
No, he actually helped, right?
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
Did he?
Yeah.
Well, and Oscar Hammerstein helped Stephen Sondheim, but they were both writing very different kinds of work. You can learn,
Told Sondheim to do.
right? But you can learn from any master, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily aping the master, or that the master can do what you can do. I think would be my
No, exactly.
response to that. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't honestly know that he'd been involved with Larson.
Real contributor.
Yeah, and of course you know the tragic story that Larson died of an aneurysm the night before it opened. So horrible loss. But in his memory, his family gives out all the money that Rent makes to support the musical theater, which is really great. So there's Rent, which in the 90s brought another, talk about what brings the kids to the theater, you know? Boy, did that. And, you know, Rent was one of those first musicals that you could get a seat in the front of the theater for, in those days, I think it was maybe 10 or 15 bucks at most. And the kids would just line up in the hall and lobby of the theater and wait to get those and go and go and go. And if you went to that show too often, you have no eardrums left. Because certainly we're all irritated, even with this box. You know, everything is so over-amplified now that you often can't get the words and you're truly assaulted. But there's the next step in the rock musical. And then we start getting smaller and sometimes even more domestic in the stories. And let me play you something that was done a little more recently at Weston, which is also a rock musical. Whoop, sorry. I hit the wrong buttons.
They're the perfect loving family, so adoring, and I love them every day of every week. So my son's a little shit, my husband's boring, and my daughter, oh, a genius, is a freak. Still I help them love each other, father, mother, sister, brother, cheek to cheek.
So there's Curly coming on stage as a modern suburban mother who's manic depressive and has a difficult family. Oh, what a beautiful morning in Next to Normal. Setting the show up in many ways the way Rodgers and Hammerstein did. But again, no chorus. The only people on stage are the family, the doctor, the boyfriend, small ensemble, small band. I think this is one of the first musicals we did where we had as many instruments at Weston as they did on Broadway. 5. Best song, in my opinion, in the show, which we're going to do just because I like it. And just to show that rock can be really gorgeous. Heidi Blickenstaff, who did this for us last summer, was devastating, I think, in singing this.
There was a time when I flew higher. Was a time a wild girl run free. Would be me
you know the story, this is the manic depressive mother who's been drugged into normalcy, next to normal. This is the song where she decides she'd rather flush the drugs and get back to the mountains of her life. And it's called I Miss the Mountains. I miss the mountains. And it ain't about going to Wyoming.
And while she runs free and fast, seems my wild days are past. I miss the mountains. I miss the dizzy heights, all the manic magic days, and the dark depressing nights. I miss the mountains. I miss the highs and lows, all the climbing, all the falling, all the while the wild wind blows, stinging you with snow and soaking you with rain. I miss the mountains. I miss the pain.
Gorgeous, gorgeous. The new musical by this team is just opening, and I haven't followed the time, so maybe it's open if anybody's been reading it. If Then, starring Idina Menzel, who got gloriously mispronounced on the Oscars recently. Very interesting show. If you get down to New York, catch If Then. I won't tell you what it's about now, but this is a team to continue to watch. All right, that's going to take us up to this little musical we're doing this summer, and I'm going to play you the title song from Analog and Vinyl. This is by an established Broadway composer named Paul Gordon. If you are really a Broadway theater fan, you might have caught, and I didn't, his first Broadway musical, which was Jane Eyre in 2000. Starred a West End actress, actually, Marla Chappell. He now has a version of Emma, the great Jane Austen novel, which is supposed to go to Broadway. I saw it out at the Old Globe in San Diego. And this piece is coming to West End with a Broadway producer behind it who hopes to take it on to probably off-Broadway and then maybe Broadway someday. It's the first time we've had a piece that has that kind of support behind it. Doesn't guarantee it any more success than anything else, but it's exciting that they feel they can entrust the world premiere to us. And here is the title song from Analog and Vinyl, telling you why this young man loves what he does, even though it's not working for him. The influences here are the Beach Boys, the Beatles, and Elvis Costello.
When the needle hits the groove, I have nothing left to prove. Brian Wilson is a star as he brags about his car. Beach Boys start to sing, and I don't hear a thing except the sound of surf guitar. British singles top the charts. Teenage love and broken hearts. 45's and Nat King Cole. Motown turning out more soul. Beat up Sam and Dave. My rebels misbehave, but heed the cause of rock and roll. And just like analog and vinyl, I will not forgive as the record skirts spin.
Pretty common in the new musical that when you sing about analog and vinyl, it's a metaphor. When you sing about I Miss the Mountains, it's not I'm in Oklahoma, right? It's I miss the heights of my life pre-balanced drugs. Another element of, more often, of the new musicals. I have a whole lot more stuff here which there's no time to share, so now I'm going to do one of these dangerous things and just blitz you with everything I don't have time to tell you, so that I don't feel guilty that I didn't impart what I wanted you to know. And if you give me your email, I'll just send you my notes and you can know it. But things to look for in the new musical now. Subject matter. Almost always, there's obviously exceptions to every rule, contemporary, social, often satirical. Size. Smaller cast, no chorus, ensemble storytelling, band, not orchestra, shorter length, increasingly 90 minutes without intermission. I just went to two shows in New York that were 55 and 60 minutes. The book is less freestanding now. These shows are much more sung through. Next to Normal last year, 39 songs in Next to Normal. Very little dialogue. Recitative, going back to Operaland, becomes more and more important. The ground rules laid by Rodgers and Hammerstein with the great soliloquies. Much more of that happening now. And often not a linear story. The music, as I said, few reprises. Here's something interesting in the very newest composers now, and kind of irritating. If you've gone to a lot of our new musicals, some of you have commented on this, they don't like you to applaud. So they don't end their numbers or they don't button them, so you have no chance to interrupt their story. We come from a generation, I'm talking about opera, you know, I mean, my Lord, where we want to interrupt, and the young generation wants you to stay on the ride. And sometimes we have to fight them on that when we say that part of our experience is to be able to emote occasionally or take a pee break on the ride. Don't make us ride the whole time, we're going to blow up. But that tends to be what they're doing now, which is very interesting and sometimes frustrating. Generally no overture or entr'acte. Choreography now is movement, not dance. And very frequently the entire ensemble does it. Rocco chaired the Bill T. Jones Dance Company in New York, and Bill T. Jones is becoming one of the major choreographers on Broadway now. He did Spring Awakening. And if you see Matilda now, the choreography is very influenced by what he did. If you've gone to any of the dance theater pieces that Twyla Tharp has created, you see the work of Susan Stroman. We're getting director choreographers. Michael Barres, who directed Next to Normal for us, and is directing Analog and Vinyl, is one of those. You don't want a separate choreographer who comes in and makes the dance happen now. You want somebody who knows how to use all the tools with all the actors to tell the story in the fullest and most organic way. On online presence, self-publishing. If you're interested in this stuff now, remember New Musical Theater with an R-E, like Weston Playhouse Theatre Company, .com. newmusicaltheater.com. You'll find most of the exciting and important new writers on that site, and it's where they're selling their music, and they are known all over the country to high school kids and college kids who've never seen a production of their shows, and in some cases their shows haven't even been produced, but who are discovering them on the internet and are singing their songs and building a passion for it. When Heidi Blickenstaff, who did Next to Normal for us last summer, was here doing a concert of our most recent new musical, kids came from high schools in Rutland and from Williams College, and I actually couldn't tell the difference. College kids look like high school kids to me anymore, because they followed Heidi's work. She helped develop a new musical, which actually workshopped at Weston, called Title of Show. They follow them on the internet, and if they can get to see them somewhere, they will. But increasingly, there are other ways. The old days of listening to, you know, Rosemary Clooney or Aretha Franklin singing the hit from the musical. Now, everybody wants to sing it themselves. They want to own it themselves. They want to find it on the internet. The two top CD producers are not Columbia and all those names you used to know. One is our board member, Kurt Deutsch, Shikaboom and Ghostlight Records. which is the major producer of Broadway cast albums now. They did Book of Mormon, which was the biggest selling cast album in Broadway history. He did Next to Normal. He just did Bridges of Madison County. And PS Classics, both of which I'll venture to say you probably never heard of. Go on their websites. That's where those musicals are getting recorded. Often in a production that never gets to Broadway because they think the work is good enough, and while it wasn't commercial, it needs to be preserved. So the online presence, terribly important. And finally, as I hinted earlier, the development cycle now is not two smart guys in a room writing until they go to Boston, Philadelphia, New Haven, and then New York. It's Western Vermont. It's places all over the country that love theater, that are generous enough to come and say, you're birthing a baby here, and it's not fully grown, and I get that, but I'm willing to be a part of the community that helps it grow up. And that's what it is to develop new work. And it's so exciting to us that our audiences are increasingly willing to go on that journey because they understand it's not a finished product. It is a journey. And that the ones that get finished enough to reach a larger audience and have a future life, you're going to be the one to say, I was there when that kid got pulled out of the womb. And I wasn't sure he was going to make it, but I'm proud that he did. Enough. Questions? Comments? John?
Where would you put Andrew Lloyd Webber's work in your continuum of there?
To me, he's in the pop area. Hugely successful, again, based on opera, but he is a beach ball writer for me. You know, I think he's really good at what he does, and he's not a genius. I think he has a really good ear, and he doesn't steal, but he creates from another idiom, and you can often find other people's music in his music. But he's got a great gift for tunes, and the shows are hugely successful. But for my taste, I want Stephen Sondheim or Adam Guettel or somebody who I think has a really distinct and original voice. But that's where I would put it. That's a subjective answer now.
Doesn't he deserve a little bit of credit with when he was working with Rice, though? I mean, the lyrics made his music more.
Yes, and honestly, you make a very good point there about lyricists. And although I told you that the book is beginning to disappear in the musical as they become more sung through, the book writer are hugely unsung heroes. And Richard Rodgers was lucky enough to write with two very different guys, but both Lorenz Hart and Oscar Hammerstein were masters at what they did. Sondheim has rarely worked with a good book writer. Thank God he writes his own lyrics, which he's a genius at. But Paul Gordon normally does the music. In this musical, it's the first time he's actually done the lyrics and the book. So, but yes, point well taken. Of course, as you know, the early stuff was done as and it was done as albums. It really wasn't intended to be shows, and then they started to become shows. But
much like
still works.
It is today, where people are looking to get their foundation through getting their music out. They were doing the same thing.
Exactly. In their own way at that time. Totally. Other thoughts, questions? Yes.
I'm probably someone who's more the golden age than the other two.
I think most of us are. We're only early into that era, and there's a lot of difficulty in getting through the weeds there.
Could you address briefly royalty between the golden age and the new musical? If they're cast or lowered, for someone in a community theater or another theater to do the golden age, the royalties are extravagant in most cases.
Right. Well, as you know, the royalties are directly related to marketability, obviously. And ultimately, there really are only a few dozen musicals that are pretty much licenses to print money. The rest of them, you got to take a risk of sorts to see if it's going to work. It's pretty hard to ruin My Fair Lady or any of those great classics. I would argue if you've got the skill set to do it, it's even kind of hard to ruin Rent. But royalties are generally related to how well it is sold over time. And when something is brand new, the royalty will be very high if it's done well. We can't even touch, I don't know if amateur groups can, I don't think they can, Wicked, Jersey Boys, Mamma Mia, the Phantom, the shows that are still making big bucks after in some cases, many decades on Broadway. So those are going to cost you more than The King and I when they become available, as Les Mis did when it was first available. It's not surprising. Our late friend Clark Gessner, who wrote You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, before I knew Clark, it used to frustrate the heck out of me that little old You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown had the most ridiculously high royalty because every high school in the world wanted to do it. So it's purely related to marketplace. So it's not necessarily limited to Golden
But
Age.
the new musical era,
Right.
if there's smaller casts, smaller bands,
The royalty still might be exorbitant when it's first available, but your other carrying costs are considerably less. But the other wonderful phenomenon, and I'm mad at us at Weston now for not having really minted and branded this. Rocco always reminds us about branding. One of the great successes now with musicals is when a large musical is made small and done in an original way. John Doyle is the director from England and New York now who's done it most often, and the Sondheim's Sweeney Todd and Company he did. But again, this happened with some of the shows that have come from the smaller theaters in London as well. Weston's been doing that for years, but we never really took credit for it. But so there are ways to find, even to do the old ones. People are doing concert versions in the same way that they do the one-man Christmas Carol. So you just have to think of other ways to do it if you can't afford that. Monica.
Steve, to what extent is the size of the new musical, the band instead of the orchestra, the small cast, the ensemble instead of the chorus, a function of the astronomical costs of producing a big show?
Oh.
Or is there something philosophical behind it as well?
I think it's both, but I honestly think it's more driven by the cost.
The economic.
Yeah, I mean, musicals, one of the reasons Weston has spent more time developing musicals than plays is that there are less theaters doing it because they're more expensive and more complicated, and 50% of the work we do every year is musical. We believe deeply in it. And we felt that as we took our first steps into developing new work, we ought to be both playing to one of our loves and strengths and helping, the form where it most needed to be helped. But inevitably, it has as much to do about economy as anything. And honestly, I see the young people when they're deciding what to write about, they have to find a story that can be told on a smaller scale. The new musical that we just did in award this year, they can't think of a way to get the cast smaller than 10. And that's actually big now for an unknown musical. And it's by an established composer, and it's quite an interesting piece, but they're going to have trouble with that. Rocco.
Would you call a cabaret environment an art form somewhere in the mix of those three balls?
No, cabaret is its own thing. I mean, not obviously Weston's cabaret is really its own thing. But cabaret is generally solo artists or a group of solo artists who, like, Bobby Short or Barbara Cook, are reinterpreting the songs through their masterful sense of personal musicianship and connection. And it's piano bar at its best. Yeah. But it's a different form.
I probably should know the answer to this, but
well,
I
Ralph,
remember the pits being required.
Right.
Like a harpist always had work.
Yeah.
That has changed.
It is changing because it just had to. One of the things that used to outrage me, as much as I love professional musicians, is that they had such a strong union that shows of a certain size on Broadway were told how big their orchestra had to be. And if it didn't need that or wasn't written for that, they had to hire you to sit there, even though there was no harp part, and play cards every night in those days because there was no internet, in order to meet the union rules. Now, that is also, frankly, related to the shrinking of the show thing, too. Because it's a little harder to say that a 5-character musical set in a house with a mother popping pills needs 30 musicians to support it. So there's a little kind of organic thing going on there.
So they end run the union.
Yeah, and in all honesty, the strongest union, you've read the articles in the New York Times, is the stagehands, not the musicians. So, you can cut away a little bit of that. What the musicians are scared about, of course, is all the stuff that's being done digitally now. And people that can take, one synthesizer into the theater and We were so proud for so long that Weston was one of the few theaters where you could go and actually hear acoustic sound, people singing unamplified. We can't do it anymore, A, because most of the shows that are being written have a rock score that's amplified and you'll never be heard, and B, because the singers are no longer trained to be able to do 8 shows a week with no understudy, because Weston can't afford a second cast to step in when they lose their voice. So that world's changed too. Judy.
I am not a great fan of the rock musical, but I am of Tommy. Would you? I mean, I thought that was a brilliant musical.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great musical. And of course, that's an example of something that started as a recording and then, got dramatized. But I think, it worked. And it's wonderful, wonderful music. Yeah. Well, give Analog and Vinyl a try. You might decide you like rock musicals.
We'll all be there.
I hope you will. I'll be looking for everyone. And he has to get his free tickets, though, so get that in.
Isn't it almost like there is a fourth category missing in the new musical with the inundation of what you already called the jukebox?
Yeah, and I started actually having more categories, and then I said, oh my God, these people, have to go home to dinner at some point. I think what you could honestly say, though, is that the jukebox musicals are going to fit under those stylistic categories.
It kind of reminds me of the operettas, where they're just throwing stuff together.
Right. The best of them, like Jersey Boys, or now, I haven't seen it, but apparently the Carole King musical, which my friend also recorded, is really good. And it isn't just that you love the music, but it has a story. I've never seen Mamma Mia. Not a big ABBA fan to begin with, but even that has more of a story than Hair. But those are jukebox musicals that are taking existing songs and kind of fashioning sort of a story around them. Smokey Joe, Cafe, never had a story. Tim Ford did the best job I've ever seen of anybody trying to give a story to a piece that had less plot than air. But it was mainly an excuse to hear the music. I would rather go to the Weston Rod and Gun Club to hear the Marvelous Wonderettes Caps and Gowns in August and hear great songs of the 50s and 60s sung in close harmony with no attempt at pretending that it's Hamlet. Just come hear the music and don't worry about it being a musical. It's a review, really, which is another form, right? Yes?
So do you think this form that you were talking about for the Golden Age, is that basically dead now? I mean, you think of like something like the Book of Mormon, which is, it seems like it fits that form, but it's
the Book of Mormon or Urinetown or arguably to some degree Avenue Q are very bright writers who are writing in the form of the Golden Age in order to satirize it and, more importantly, to use it as a metaphor to satirize the world in which we live. So that's the difference. Now, do I think that's dead? I don't know. I mean, some bozo will be in here lecturing to a bunch of you 50 years from now when I'm 5 feet under, and the golf ball will have turned into scattershot or something. I don't know where it's going next. But so far, we have about 50 years of an era. We have a decade or so of transition, and we have another 50 years or so of an era, and we have a decade or so of transition, and we're kind of in the next 50 years. And all I can tell you is, as a guy who reads and listens to or sees about 60 new musicals a year, that's what I'm seeing.
Where would you put Matilda?
I would probably put it under pop. I love the show. I like the show better than I think I like the musical, but I haven't spent any time with the musical. I've only seen the show once and thought it was a brilliant and very contemporary production. I'd have to listen to it a little more to tell you whether I think it's a really great show or score. Certainly, I mean, Kinky Boots is talk about a show that comes right out of the Golden Age and is still kind of following the formula and makes it work, right? But definitely in the pop range there. Bridges of Madison County is high pop, but it's pop. If you get to that. Last questions and thoughts? All right, the other things I must do because I have several board members here. We have a list of our summer productions and my glasses case. Thank you. Thank you. So, please send those around. Yeah. Here, take some to the back. Come down that row. If you run out, we'll have more by the door. I don't know if we anticipated quite enough, but if you're here with someone else, maybe take one. I will not talk about the rest of the season, except it's going to be fabulous. And there's 2 plays with the name Vanya in them, so it's going to confuse the heck out of you. But they're both comedies in different ways. And also, yeah?
When you get a chance, just talk about the things you do with Ina Janis at the Dorset Theater Festival.
Yeah. But before that, another selfish plug. In the house tonight are Chris and Nancy Perry, who will have this view from their house on the hill in Weston in 2 summers, because we are more than halfway through, God help us, our capital campaign to create a year-round studio theater to replace what we do in the Weston Rod and Gun Club in the summer, but more importantly, so that we and others can do stuff year-round. More of it developmental. So if you're interested in what we're talking about today, you'll have more chances to see that kind of thing. On the Walker Farm in Weston, there's 3 actors performing an unknown play, as far as I can tell, in what might be one of the configurations of that space. Sense of what the barn-like lobby will be, and it's going to have barn doors that open into the theater space, which will be completely rearranged for every show. Arthur Klonsky finds this a dour nighttime landscape by Edward Hopper, but nonetheless, I thought it was going to be like the moth to the flame, and you'd all be attracted to the nighttime lights of the theater. And that's a view driving through the farm property and around to where you're going to park. But if you know Weston and Route 100, the Walker Farm is across from the gas station in town. So behind that, we will build a freestanding theater. And I no longer say come hell or high water because we had the ladder a few years ago, but it will happen, so stay with us. You're asking about our collaboration with other groups, and several years ago, we came together with Southern Vermont Arts Center and Manchester Music Festival and Dorset Theater to create something we called the Hills Alive Festival of the Arts, which was basically together promoting what we already do, because we weren't going to do more, we couldn't afford to. But we felt that each of our audiences weren't aware of what the others were doing, and the people were not aware that this is a cultural destination here. Somehow the Berkshires is, and we're not. And there are good things about not being, because we're not quite as inundated with traffic and higher prices and all New Yorkers as they are down there. But the quality of the work that happens in the arts in Vermont now is at a very high level. We're able to attract at Dorset and Weston and the Music Festival and at the Arts Center artists that could be in any of the finest urban centers, the North Star Performing Arts as well. So it's really important that we all work together and promote that together and get the word out there. We're seeing if we can do a kind of a common ticket booth, which I'm now beginning to wonder about technologically, not to mention the practicality for us. But we're going to find more ways to work together and to bring you more. And we're all committed to that, and we're good friends and colleagues.
Steve, I may have missed it, but GMALL is part of that Hills Alive.
And absolutely, thank you.
I want to just...
Good job.
Be careful, you'll be the next chair of the board when you start making comments.
Don't go to the ladies' room.
And then the wonderful library that's coming too. So many good things, so many good things. Are we good? Thank you all.